The nurses, the techs, and the rest of the personnel in there are not in there for a limited number of hours. You're there for 8 hours a day, or 10 hours a day, or 12 hours a day, surgeon after surgeon after surgeon. So the exposure that the non-surgeons have is generally much greater than that the surgeons have. So it does matter, and there has to be more for us to look at and things that we can do. How do we protect the staff? The people who, without operating staff, the surgeons might as well just go home and play golf. Surgical smoke travels at about 40 miles an hour. So think of driving in your car at 40 miles an hour. It's pretty good speed. That's how fast the smoke's moving throughout your room. And the concentration of that smoke can rise over 1 million parts within 5 minutes of use of electric cautery. So if I turn that cautery pencil on and use it for 5 minutes, within that 5-minute period, look what the concentration does. And now it's traveling throughout the room at 40 miles an hour. And those levels, if you measure them even at the corners of the room, will stay above normal for 20 minutes after you turn the Bovie pencil off. So this isn't just a one-shot thing, oh gosh, okay, the smoke is gone now. No, it's dissipated, you can't see it anymore. You may not be able to smell it anymore, but it's still scattered through your entire operating room, and it's going to stay elevated for 20 minutes. Again, published data that's been out for 20 years. How many in the room have gone home at some point after a long day in the operating room and you just felt weak? Anybody? I suspect if we went down this list and read every single one of those symptoms, from eye irritation to headache to sneezing to nausea, there wouldn't be a hand in the room that you wouldn't raise. Most of the time, why was that? Well, we blamed it on something else. Well, why do we get these symptoms? That's a whole list of if you really look at it, odd symptoms. Everything from sneezing, which may make sense because it's irritating your nose, to anxiety, cardiovascular dysfunction, carcinoma. How can that really be? It's tissue. All we're doing is burning tissue that's live, in most cases, normal tissue. So how can it be responsible for all that? If you take surgical smoke and you run it through a mass spec, and you start looking at all the things that are contained in it, this is an incomplete list. The list continues to grow and grow and grow. And I promise I won't go through every one of those chemicals because I will mispronounce most of them. But if we look at just a few of them, well, there's carbon dioxide. That's not so bad, right? We breathe it out every time we breathe. So surgical smoke can't be totally bad. But if you look over here, benzene. Benzene is a hydrocarbon. It's present in a lot of the oils and fuels that we use, which we're not supposed to breathe either. And if you look at the results of being around benzene constantly, it has a real negative effect on your bone marrow. It's responsible for aplastic anemia, and it's great at creating leukemias. And yet we know that in tissue we burn, there's benzene. Over there in the center column, a little bit of formaldehyde. I think you probably all are familiar with formaldehyde. It is used in some common things that we usually don't think of, like your automobile transmission. Most of us don't put our nose in our transmission and breathe it in, and that's probably a good thing. It's also used for embalming. So it's good if you're dead. Most of us that work in the operating room are not dead. And so it's probably not really good for us to be breathing all of the time. Then also, if you'll notice up there, hydrogen cyanide. Hydrogen cyanide is great in a war, and that's pretty much where hydrogen cyanide lives. 2,000 parts per million in the air of hydrogen cyanide results in human death in less than 1 minute. Now, we know that in surgical smoke, we don't have 2,000 parts per million. But what about those smaller amounts? And that's just 3 of a huge list of things that have been shown scientifically, not just a list somebody made up because it was scary, but have been shown to exist when you take an electric cautery in it and you vaporize tissue and you destroy the proteins in those cells. There's more and more proof in the research, more and more studies that now show that there are the toxic compounds that we just talked about, irritants, carcinogens, and neurotoxins. There are viral diseases and there are malignant cells, and they are not dead. They are capable of transmission. You see the picture on the screen there. This was reported out of Germany in 2003, in which the cell type was matched back to the patient. So we know that in this study it was not just a happenstance that they both had the same process. You can see the mass on the vocal cords of this operating room personnel that matched exactly the papillomavirus that they were working on the patient. So transmission of live cells from the patient to the healthcare provider, still capable of growing. The same thing has also been shown with melanoma transferred after surgical removal using electric cautery. So even though we're vaporizing tissue, we're releasing a lot of cells. Not every cell dies. Likely it's on the cells of the edge of the area we cauterized, and we may have injured them, or we may not have injured them at all, but we set them free. They traveled at 40 miles an hour through your operating room, and they went through your mask, assuming you had a mask on and it was worn correctly, and they went wherever you decided the air in your body should go. Everyone's aware of the dangers of cigarette smoking, and whether you're a cigarette smoker or not, in real life, that's a choice that people make. Yes, we know there's an increased risk of cancer, and we know that if you sit in a room with a cigarette smoker, the secondhand smoke is also the same risk. And the risk for oral cancer, esophageal cancer, gastric cancer, bladder cancer, cardiac disease, again, a long list of things can happen. And certainly in the operating room, we don't go in, light a cigarette in the room, let it burn over the top of the patient so all the healthcare workers can smell it and suck the secondary smoke in. But how does that smoke compare to what we are around? Particulate size matters. If you take a look at the particle size of various things that we can compare it to, tobacco smoke, that we just talked about, that we know is bad, 0.1 to 3 microns. Well, look at surgical smoke, 0.1 to 5 microns. So the size of surgical smoke is nearly identical to the size of tobacco smoke. So smoking in the operating room by inhaling surgical smoke is very similar to sitting in a room with a smoker who has a cigarette and inhaling that smoke. We know one is bad. We frequently choose to ignore the other. And then if you look at all the other sizes, obviously what you see is a cascading event going down. But what's really important is notice over here, 0.6 microns is the biggest thing we're going to talk about. And a little bit when we look at different respiratory protective devices, that 0.6 is going to seem like a really, really small number for most things. MRSA, one of the largest bacteria that we encounter frequently, 0.6 microns, and then you can see all the way down to where you have electric cautery, HIV, and secondary smoke almost exactly the same. 0.1, 0.2, 0.3, 0.4 microns in size. Very small, very capable of getting through a lot of things that we believe, without really knowing, may be providing us some protection. This was another fairly alarming thing to me when I used to think surgical smoke smelled really good. 1 gram of tissue consumed by a CO2 laser, if you look at the ability to cause mutation of cells, is like 3 cigarettes after 15 minutes. Once again, I'm not a big laser user, so I believed that lasers were bad, but electric cautery can't be that bad, right? Well, I was wrong again. If you look at turning on an electric cautery unit and burning 1 gram of tissue, it's twice as bad as using the laser. So all the forms of increased energy, heat and light, electric cautery and laser, create that vaporization of the proteins in the tissue. Well, 1 gram, how often do we actually destroy 1 gram of tissue at a time in an operating room? Sounds like a pretty big number. Sounds like, we're usually just using a little bit here and there. Well, in the lab, we decided to really take a look at that. This is 1 gram of muscle on one side, 1 gram of fat on the other side, and they're laying on a standard 4x4 surgical gauze. So it's really not a very big piece of tissue.